like the video, subscribe, and comment your country below so I know who's listening tonight. Turn off the lights and put on headphones for the full horror experience. Let's begin the nightmare. If you're brave enough. I arrived in Black Hollow because I thought isolation would fix me, because the city had drained something vital from me, and the therapist I couldn't afford anymore once told me I needed quiet, nature, solitude to remember what was left of me. But Black Hollow was not a place people went to find peace. It was a place people went when something darker inside them whispered that the world of the living had nothing more to offer. A place where the trees were taller than any building I had ever seen, and the fog was so thick it made the ground look like it was breathing, and the locals stared a little too long, as if silently asking why I had come. Because nobody just wandered into Black Hollow. They either belonged to it or ran from it. But the innkeeper greeted me kindly, though his eyes never smiled, and he told me in a low, gravelly voice that the town had a personality, that the woods had habits, and that I should be careful walking alone after sunset, especially near the ruins of the old church. But of course, when someone tells you not to do something, some stupid part of you becomes even more curious. And the first night I heard something move outside my window, something big, dragging something else heavy, slow, rhythmic like a body, but when I looked out there was only fog and silence, so I convinced myself it was just an animal, even though the forest outside was too dead for wildlife. But I didn't know that yet. I didn't know anything. Not until the second day, when I met the sheriff, who told me, with a straight face, that this town wasn't designed for wanderers, that I shouldn't go into the woods without a guide, and that if I ever heard a bell ring after midnight I should lock my doors and pretend I didn't hear it. But I laughed, because what kind of town has a bell that rings itself at night? And he didn't laugh back, he just stared, like he was waiting for something inside me to understand. But I didn't understand anything until 3 nights later, when I walked through the woods alone, ignoring the warnings, ignoring the weird tension in the air, ignoring my own instinct, because I thought I was braver than fear. But I've learned since then that bravery isn't courage. Bravery is ignorance pretending to be strength. The woods didn't sound like woods, they sounded like a graveyard, silent, breathless, as if even insects avoided them. And the deeper I walked, the colder the air became, unnaturally cold, and I started noticing symbols carved into the trees, crude, jagged, as if made by shaking hands or claws. Symbols that matched the strange drawings on an old map I found in my room earlier that evening. A map that wasn't there when I checked in. A map that had no roads, only landmarks, the inn, a well, and something labeled the Church of the Promise. And I followed the map not because I was brave, but because I was stupid. Because I thought everything mysterious existed to entertain me, not to consume me. And eventually I reached a clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle, their trunks twisted like contorted bodies, and in the center of that circle stood the remains of a stone building, tall, crooked, leaning like it had been holding its breath for years and finally decided to exhale. And the air changed around me, thickening, as if something unseen had shifted its attention, like the woods had eyes, and I felt it before I heard it, a vibration in my bones, deep, humming, hungry. Then the sound came. One single ring of a bell, loud, metallic, echoing across the forest like thunder swallowed by darkness, and I froze because there was no bell tower on the church, no mechanism, nothing. Yet the sound came again and again, slow, deliberate, 12 times, just like the sheriff said. And when it ended, the silence wasn't calm, it was suffocating, as if the ring had woken something ancient, and now the air held its breath, waiting for whatever came next. I approached the church door carefully, though I don't know why. Maybe I thought that moving quietly would make me invisible. But nothing could make me invisible to what was inside that place, because when I stepped over the threshold the temperature dropped so violently I could see my breath for the first time, and all the candles that lined the walls were burning, even though there were no matches, no lighters, no signs of people. Only hundreds of wax-dripping candles forming circles, spirals, symbols, and in the center of the floor was a book, thick, black, made of leather that looked too organic to be animal hide, as if the skin had been peeled from something that wasn't meant to be skinned. And when I opened the book my stomach turned, because each page was filled with names, thousands of them, written in different handwriting, some shaky, some elegant, some childlike, every name followed by a date and a bloody fingerprint, and I knew, instinctively, that these weren't signatures of membership, they were signatures of sacrifice, and when I turned to the final page, my hands shaking, I found blank spaces waiting to be filled, and above them, in perfect ink, my full name. I didn't write it. I never signed anything. I had never even spoken my full name aloud since I arrived, yet the page knew me, and in that moment I realized I had not stumbled into something. I had been lured, called, chosen, and the realization paralyzed me, rooted me in place, because suddenly something stepped into the church behind me, slow, heavy, deliberate, like feet carved from bone scraping against stone. And I didn't turn around, because every instinct screamed that turning would mean surrender, but the air behind me heated, burned, and I smelled sulfur and rot and something older than time, and a voice spoke, not in words, but in sensations, a chorus of rage and hunger that seeped directly into my head, bypassing language altogether, and I knew then that the legends weren't exaggerated. Black Hollow wasn't a town haunted by ghosts, it was a town owned by something worse, a patron, a keeper, a collector, a force the old settlers had invoked with promises and blood, believing they could control it, and instead, becoming its servants, and now I was part of it, not because I wanted to, but because something ancient had written my name into its ledger. I felt a hand, cold and clawed, brush the back of my neck, and every muscle in my body collapsed, not from injury but from obedience, a surrender built into my biology, and I fell to my knees, staring at the book, at my unwritten lines, and the entity leaned close enough that its breath burned the back of my skull, and it whispered, finally in language, "Right?" And my hand moved without my consent, fingers closing around a quill that I swear hadn't been there before, dipping into ink that was too thick, too dark to be anything but blood, and I wrote the first letter of my name. But before I could finish, the entity screamed, a violent roar that shook the walls and extinguished the candles, because something, somewhere, interrupted the ritual, and in the brief flash of darkness I saw its shape, tall, skeletal, horned, wrapped in shadows that moved like living smoke, eyes red as molten metal, mouth wide and full of jagged teeth, a grotesque parody of a grin. And when the candles flickered back on, it was gone, leaving me alone in the freezing church, shaking, sweating, half-mad, and the unfinished letter of my name glowed like a burning wound on the page, pulsing slowly, as if waiting for me to finish it, and I realized then that Black Hollow wasn't haunted for decades. It was fed, worshipped, sustained, and I had walked straight into its history without understanding that once you saw the devil in Black Hollow, you never walked back out unchanged. The storm did not return that night, but the unease did, settling into every corner of the village like an invisible fog, and as the days stretched forward, Helen began to understand that the devil did not arrive with thunder and lightning. It arrived quietly, patiently, and it lured its prey with promises of peace before it consumed them. And she saw this firsthand when Mrs. Connor, the old woman from the hill, was found staring out her window for hours, unmoving, as though hypnotized by something no one else could see, and when a neighbor tried to talk to her, she muttered something about a stranger who came to her door at night, whispering her name like a lover, telling her that death was not an end but a passage, and she said his eyes were full of stars, which would have sounded poetic if it didn't make everyone shiver, because in this place, people did not speak of stars as heavenly, they spoke of them as eyes watching from above, judging below, and Helen, though she didn't want to, was drawn deeper into the horror when she started finding strange symbols carved into her studio door, crude spirals and jagged marks, as though done with a shaking hand or maybe claws, and at first she dismissed them, thinking some drunk had wandered too close, but the carvings returned every morning, always more elaborate, and she noticed something else. No matter how cold the nights were, the wood around the carvings was warm to the touch, like a heartbeat throbbed behind them, and she hated how she felt afraid in a place she once thought would heal her, and she wondered if she had escaped madness or merely relocated it. But then came the night where she woke at 3:03 a.m. again, not from a sound this time, not from a scream or a storm, but from the unmistakable sensation of someone breathing beside her bed, a slow humid exhale brushing against her face as though inches away, and when she opened her eyes, she didn't see someone in the room. She saw someone reflected in the mirror across from her bed, a tall figure with shadow-black skin and horns that curved backward like broken branches, and its chest rose and fell, mimicking her breath, as though it was living off her fear, feeding on it. And Helen froze, held captive in the dark, thinking that if she moved, if she screamed, if she breathed wrong, it would cross from reflection to reality, and she couldn't help but notice, with sickening dread, that its mouth was twisted into a smile, but not a grin of joy, a grin of recognition, as though it had been watching her long before she arrived here, studying her, waiting for the moment she would finally wake and notice it. And the thing lifted its elongated fingers and tapped on the inside of the mirror, each tap vibrating through her skull, and with each tap she heard a whisper, not a voice outside but inside her head, low and ancient, saying, "You were chosen before birth." And suddenly the mirror cracked, thin fractures webbing outward like fragile ice. And as she struggled to scream, the figure vanished, leaving only her reflection, pale and shaking. And for a moment she wondered if she imagined it, if trauma or sleep deprivation had sculpted terror into hallucination. But then she saw the imprint on the mirror. 3 distinct fingerprints burned into the glass, smoldering like embers, impossible, undeniable, and she ran outside, gasping for air, expecting the night to offer freedom. But instead she found the village awake, lights in windows, people murmuring prayers, and she realized they had heard it too, not the breathing or the tapping, but a sound that echoed across the valley, a low rumbling that did not come from the earth or the sky, but from below both. And every dog in town howled, and every child hid under beds, and every adult did what generations before them did: lit candles, not for light, but as payment, because here, flame was not illumination, it was currency. And Helen watched as Mrs. Connor stood outside her house, candle shaking in her trembling hands, eyes wide with the grief of someone who knew what was coming, whispering to anyone who would listen, "He's walking again, the old devil, the one who owns this place." And Helen wanted answers, wanted logic, but the universe offered none, only fear. And the old woman continued, "When he chooses someone, he marks their door, he marks their mind, and he waits." And Helen's blood froze because she knew, without speaking, she had been marked, but before she could ask why, a distant scream cut through the valley, raw and primal, and the villagers did not run toward it. They did not attempt rescue. They simply locked their doors, shut their windows, and blew out their candles, because the rule here was simple: when the devil hunts, no one sees, no one speaks, and no one helps. And Helen, standing there in the dark, felt the crushing realization that isolation was not a consequence. It was ritual, and she wondered not if she could escape the demon, but whether it had already claimed her soul long before she ever stepped foot in this accursed place. The storm did not return that night, but the unease did, settling into every corner of the village like an invisible fog. And as the days stretched forward, Helen began to understand that the devil did not arrive with thunder and lightning. It arrived quietly, patiently, and it lured its prey with promises of peace before it consumed them. And she saw this firsthand when Mrs. Connor, the old woman from the hill, was found staring out her window for hours, unmoving, as though hypnotized by something no one else could see. And when a neighbor tried to talk to her, she muttered something about a stranger who came to her door at night, whispering her name like a lover, telling her that death was not an end but a passage. And she said his eyes were full of stars, which would have sounded poetic if it didn't make everyone shiver, because in this place, people did not speak of stars as heavenly, they spoke of them as eyes watching from above, judging below. And Helen, though she didn't want to, was drawn deeper into the horror when she started finding strange symbols carved into her studio door, crude spirals and jagged marks, as though done with a shaking hand or maybe claws. And at first she dismissed them, thinking some drunk had wandered too close, but the carvings returned every morning, always more elaborate, and she noticed something else. No matter how cold the nights were, the wood around the carvings was warm to the touch, like a heartbeat throbbed behind them. And she hated how she felt afraid in a place she once thought would heal her, and she wondered if she had escaped madness or merely relocated it. But then came the night where she woke at 3:03 a.m. again, not from a sound this time, not from a scream or a storm, but from the unmistakable sensation of someone breathing beside her bed, a slow humid exhale brushing against her face as though inches away, and when she opened her eyes, she didn't see someone in the room. She saw someone reflected in the mirror across from her bed, a tall figure with shadow-black skin and horns that curved backward like broken branches, and its chest rose and fell, mimicking her breath, as though it was living off her fear, feeding on it. And Helen froze, held captive in the dark, thinking that if she moved, if she screamed, if she breathed wrong, it would cross from reflection to reality, and she couldn't help but notice, with sickening dread, that its mouth was twisted into a smile, but not a grin of joy, a grin of recognition, as though it had been watching her long before she arrived here, studying her, waiting for the moment she would finally wake and notice it. And the thing lifted its elongated fingers and tapped on the inside of the mirror, each tap vibrating through her skull, and with each tap she heard a whisper, not a voice outside but inside her head, low and ancient, saying, "You were chosen before birth." And suddenly the mirror cracked, thin fractures webbing outward like fragile ice. And as she struggled to scream, the figure vanished, leaving only her reflection, pale and shaking, and for a moment she wondered if she imagined it, if trauma or sleep deprivation had sculpted terror into hallucination. But then she saw the imprint on the mirror. 3 distinct fingerprints burned into the glass, smoldering like embers, impossible, undeniable, and she ran outside, gasping for air, expecting the night to offer freedom. But instead she found the village awake, lights in windows, people murmuring prayers, and she realized they had heard it too, not the breathing or the tapping, but a sound that echoed across the valley, a low rumbling that did not come from the earth or the sky, but from below both. And every dog in town howled, and every child hid under beds, and every adult did what generations before them did: lit candles, not for light, but as payment, because here, flame was not illumination, it was currency. And Helen watched as Mrs. Connor stood outside her house, candle shaking in her trembling hands, eyes wide with the grief of someone who knew what was coming, whispering to anyone who would listen, "He's walking again, the old devil, the one who owns this place." And Helen wanted answers, wanted logic, but the universe offered none, only fear. And the old woman continued, "When he chooses someone, he marks their door, he marks their mind, and he waits." And Helen's blood froze because she knew, without speaking, she had been marked, but before she could ask why, a distant scream cut through the valley, raw and primal, and the villagers did not run toward it. They did not attempt rescue. They simply locked their doors, shut their windows, and blew out their candles, because the rule here was simple: when the devil hunts, no one sees, no one speaks, and no one helps. And Helen, standing there in the dark, felt the crushing realization that isolation was not a consequence. It was ritual, and she wondered not if she could escape the demon, but whether it had already claimed her soul long before she ever stepped foot in this accursed place. The morning after the screams, the town pretended nothing happened, as though denial was armor, and Helen found herself trapped in this strange choreography of silence, where everyone went about their day with hollow eyes and tight mouths. And she tried to confront the sheriff, a tired man named Willis with deep scars on his forearms that looked suspiciously like bite marks, but he only said, "Forget what you heard, forget what you think you saw. Strangers don't last long when they go digging." And when she pressed him, he slammed his fist on the desk with such force the drawer rattled, as though fear had replaced blood in his veins. And Helen realized then that this town was not controlled by law or religion. It was controlled by some unwritten pact older than memory, older than language, and she wondered for the first time if she would end up like the others, quiet, beaten, numb. But she didn't have time to decide, because later that day, she discovered another symbol carved into her studio door, deeper, angrier, as though whoever or whatever made it was impatient now. And before she could think, she heard a voice behind her, smooth, male, ancient, saying, "He leaves those for the ones he favors." And she turned to find a priest, young, tall, with unsettlingly calm eyes. But there was something wrong about him, something off, because he did not look like someone who battled evil. but someone who studied it with scientific fascination. And he told her, without being asked, that the devil had walked this valley long before it was a village, long before it had a name, long before faith existed, and he whispered, almost lovingly, "He is not a fallen angel, he is older than angels," and Helen felt her brain try to reject the words because they tasted like poison, but before she could protest, the priest smiled, a gentle, almost sympathetic curve of lips, and said, "He chooses the wounded because they are easier to break," and the words hit too close, because she had come here after losing everything. Her relationship, her stability, her sanity, and her trauma had not healed. It had simply changed shape, waiting for something worse to feed on it, and she felt sick, wondering if her suffering had summoned something ancient, or if it had sensed her before she sensed it. That night, she couldn't sleep, so she walked the outskirts of the woods, trying to calm her mind. But the forest did not sound natural anymore. No insects, no wind, only a low hum, like a massive beast asleep beneath the soil, breathing in long, slow cycles, and she felt the ground vibrate beneath her boots, and she heard whispers, dozens, maybe hundreds, overlapping voices that were too soft to understand but too loud to ignore, and suddenly, she saw a figure between the trees, impossibly tall, skeletal, with limbs that moved too fluidly to be human, and its skull-like head turned toward her with a suddenness that made her body convulse with terror, and she wanted to run. But roots snaked up around her ankles, not physically, but mentally, her body refusing to move as she watched the creature rise, its spine cracking, limbs extending as though unfolding from centuries of confinement, and it stepped forward, each movement accompanied by a sound like bones scraping stone, and she thought of every story she'd heard of demons, but none described this. Nothing described something so old it didn't need fire or wings to frighten, because its mere existence was horror, its very presence a contradiction to the human idea of safety, and it lifted one hand, long fingers curling inward like beckoning, and Helen finally broke free, turning and running blindly, her breath ragged, her bones aching, but even as she fled, she heard a whisper inside her skull, not loud, almost tender, "Do you think the forest protects you?" And she didn't know if she imagined it, but she thought she heard laughter, soft, cruel, echoing through the trees, and when she reached her house, she saw lights turning on all around the village, windows opening, residents stepping outside holding lanterns, as though responding to a silent alarm they had known their whole lives, and the priest appeared beside her, not out of breath, not surprised, just tired, and he said, "He's awake earlier than expected," and Helen asked, trembling, "What does he want?" And the priest answered with the calm certainty of someone reciting scripture. "He wants what he's always wanted. Someone to carry him. Someone to return him to the world that forgot him." And Helen stared, dumbfounded, feeling her future collapse inward, and whispered, "Why me?" And the priest looked at her with something like pity, murmuring, "Because you're already broken, and broken things don't fight long." But before she could respond, before she could scream, the forest groaned like a living thing, and every light in the valley flickered, went out, and the darkness that followed felt not empty, but inhabited, as though the night itself had eyes. By sunrise the village looked deceptively normal, smoke floating from chimneys, children walking to the small schoolhouse, people exchanging tired greetings, but Helen understood now that this wasn't peace, this was a ritual of pretending, a performance designed to keep the mind from fracturing under the truth, and she sensed it in their eyes, this barely contained terror they carried like a second heartbeat, because everyone had seen it. Maybe not the creature itself, but its signs, its movements through the trees, its influence on their dreams, and the night before hadn't been a random awakening. It had been the beginning of something inevitable, and Helen realized with growing horror that she hadn't been the first outsider to come here. Others had arrived before her, curious, wounded, lost, and the forest had swallowed them whole, leaving only whispers behind, so she forced Sheriff Willis into a corner, demanded answers, demanded honesty, and the sheriff, exhausted and bloodshot, finally broke, telling her the truth in fragments, like a confession delivered under torture, that the being in the woods wasn't just a demon but a remnant of something older than gods, something imprisoned beneath the soil long before humans existed, and the village was built over the prison of a forgotten titan, bound by rituals and blood and silence, and once every few decades, when the stars aligned and the ground thawed, it stirred, hungry for a host, but not just any host. Someone who had known despair deep enough to break the flesh of their identity, someone with trauma carved so deep their mind was a cracked vessel waiting to be filled, and Helen, with her grief etched into every breath, was exactly the vessel it sought. So the town had adopted an ancient rule: never speak of it, never acknowledge its hunger, never give it shape through words, because naming a thing was feeding it. But the night before, when Helen looked at it, really looked, she had broken that rule, and now everything was spiraling faster than anyone could manage, and the sheriff explained that there had been a ritual millennia ago to bind it. But over centuries knowledge had been lost, priests replaced by pretenders, guardians replaced by cowards, until the only thing left was fear and superstition masquerading as control, and Helen demanded to see proof, demanded to see the records. So he took her to the buried archives beneath the abandoned church, where the walls were coated in soot and bone dust, and the air smelled like stale blood, and she saw drawings carved into stone, crude depictions of a towering skeletal figure with a maw like an inverted crown, and sacrifices kneeling before it, their skulls split open like cracked eggs. But what disturbed her most wasn't the carvings of violence, it was the carvings of worship, because the ancients had loved this thing, begged it for power, carved its name into their flesh like devotional scripture. And Helen realized, with growing dread, that this creature wasn't just a curse. It was a god that once ruled a world so violent that hell was seen as an escape from it, and humanity's oldest memory wasn't fear of hell, but fear of going back to what came before. And the priest, who had been silent until then, finally spoke, telling her that the being had shaped the valley itself, bending trees to form boundaries, whispering into the heads of the settlers who first arrived, guiding them to build homes, to breed children, to craft the society that would one day house him again. And Helen asked, "If you know all of this, why don't you stop it?" And his expression twisted into something like shame, because the truth was they didn't want to stop it. Not all of them, not anymore, because there were those in town who had begun to see the creature not as a threat but as salvation, believing that its awakening would purge the world of its rot, tear away the modern skin of humanity and return them to something primal and perfect. And Helen realized with horror that the church wasn't a sanctuary, it was a recruitment center, grooming broken souls to accept annihilation as redemption. And then came the worst news. The creature was no longer bound to the forest alone. Now that it had sensed her, marked her, tasted her fear, it could move through the village, through the walls, through the dreams of anyone connected to her. And bodies had begun turning up. Animals first, livestock flayed open, organs removed with surgical precision. But soon humans would follow, because the priest whispered that it was learning again, remembering how to hunt, remembering how to eat. And when the first human corpse was found, an elderly woman, jaw unhinged, spine scooped out from the inside like marrow from a bone, the town panicked, not because they didn't expect it, but because they expected it sooner. And Helen felt the guilt crush her, believing she had triggered the slaughter, believing she was responsible for every death to come. But then she discovered something that shattered her even deeper. A locked drawer in the sheriff's office containing faded photographs of outsiders who had come before her, all dead or missing, all drawn to this place by some invisible thread, their despair exploited to sustain a cycle of sacrifice. And she realized she hadn't stumbled into this nightmare by accident. She had been lured, manipulated, summoned, her grief weaponized by something older than language. And she wasn't the chosen one, she was the next meal. So Helen swore she would burn the entire village if she had to, kill every believer, fight every monster, because she would not be consumed quietly. But as she stepped outside, the ground trembled again, and a low moan erupted from the woods, so deep and ancient it cracked the windows of every house in town, and people fell to their knees, not from fear, but in worship. And in that moment Helen understood that the investigation wouldn't save anyone, because the thing in the forest wasn't hiding anymore. It was birthing itself back into the world, and the town wasn't resisting it. They were midwives to its resurrection. Night fell like a black curtain torn down by an unseen hand, swallowing the village in a darkness that felt thicker than air. and Helen understood immediately that tonight would not be another night of warnings, tremors, or cryptic prophecies. Tonight was the night of birth, death, and judgment, and she could feel it in her bones, a slow vibration like a heartbeat that wasn't human, pulsing through the soil beneath her feet, growing stronger with each step she took toward the forest, while behind her the townspeople gathered in the streets, torches and candles raised high, chanting in a language nobody alive should have known, their voices rising and falling like waves in a sea of madness, and Sheriff Willis, who earlier had shown flickers of regret, now seemed overtaken by the same fanatic trance as the others, his eyes glazed, his mouth moving in sync with the ritualistic hymn, and Helen realized with a cold shiver that she couldn't save these people. They had crossed a threshold long before she arrived, surrendering their humanity to something that promised them either power, peace, or eternal purpose, but what they would really get was consumption. So she slipped away silently, armed with a knife she found in the church basement and a canister of gasoline stolen from a tool shed, telling herself she could at least burn the forest, at least disrupt whatever resurrection was coming, even if it meant dying, because she would rather die in fire than live as a disciple of a God that fed on suffering. But the deeper she went, the more she realized she wasn't alone, because something followed, pacing her through the darkness, never stepping where the moon touched, always staying just beyond vision, mimicking her breath, her footsteps, even her heartbeat, and she knew it wasn't the creature itself, not yet, but a fragment of it, a broken-off limb of sentience designed to shepherd her forward. And the forest opened into a clearing, perfectly circular. Trees twisted inward as if bowing, and in the center lay a pit, not natural but carved, spiraling down into darkness, filled with bones and corpses in varying states of decay, some ancient, some fresh, and at the edge of the pit stood the priest, robes torn, face smeared with ash, staring at the sky with eyes too wide, too bright, whispering, "You are chosen, Helen, not because you are weak, but because you survived what others could not." And Helen felt her rage explode, demanding answers, screaming that she didn't want to be chosen, that she wanted her life, her family, her past, anything except this, and the priest simply smiled with pity and said, "Wanting has nothing to do with destiny," before stepping backward into the pit with no hesitation, disappearing into the mulch of bodies like a diver plunging into water, and the ground began to move, bones shifting, corpses twisting, merging into something colossal, and from that mass rose a body taller than the trees, built from skulls, ribs, spines, and limbs fused together, dripping with black pulp that glowed like embers, and its head, a crown of writhing spines, turned toward her, and 1,000 mouths opened and spoke not with sound but with thought, whispering, "You are hunger. You are vessel. You were born for us." And Helen screamed not from fear but from defiance, hurling the gasoline across the pit and dragging the match against a stone, sparks exploding into flame. But before she could throw it, the creature swatted her like an insect, sending her crashing into the dirt, ribs cracking, lungs collapsing, vision blurring, and she felt the match slip from her fingers, flame dying, leaving her helpless as the beast leaned down, tendrils of bone curling toward her skull, trying to pry it open, to scoop her mind out like fruit, and she tried to scream but couldn't breathe, each breath wet with blood, and she thought of her daughter, of the laughter she never heard again, the life stolen too soon, and a hatred so pure filled her that she forced her broken body to move, fingers closing around the match, dragging it again, flames sparking to life, and with the last strength she had, she whispered, "If I was born for you, then you die with me," and threw the match into the gasoline-soaked pit, igniting the entire clearing in a roar of fire so bright it erased the night, bones cracking, flesh boiling, the creature thrashing in a frenzy of rage and agony as its body collapsed inward, imploding rather than exploding, sucked into a void of its own making, while the screams of the worshippers echoed from the village, burning alive, bodies writhing in the streets, and Helen crawled away, blind from smoke, deaf from the roar, feeling the ground quake as the forest itself burned, trees falling, roots splitting, earth collapsing into the pit as though the world was erasing the evidence of what happened, and she made it to the road, collapsing under the cold moon, breath shallow, body broken, knowing she wouldn't survive the night, but feeling peace for the first time since her child died, because she hadn't been consumed, she hadn't surrendered, she had burned a god to death, and as her heartbeat slowed, she saw a single figure walking toward her. Silhouetted by fire, tall, too tall, its bones still glowing red, still forming, still alive, and she realized with her last breath, "You cannot kill what came before life, you can only delay it," and she heard the creature whisper inside her skull, not with words but with certainty, "We will try again."